Good day. Today is Sunday, 13th July 2025, and today I'm going to return again to a discussion of the assassination in Kiev of the senior SBU official, Colonel Varonich. Now, this morning, reports have appeared coming from Kiev that the two people who the Ukrainian authorities say assassinated Colonel Varonich, have been tracked down and killed by the Ukrainian security services. Now, the Ukrainians, the SBU, are saying that two individuals were killed, a man and a woman. They've released pictures which show two bodies. They don't show faces or anything that could identify these people. But anyway, they show two bodies of two people in civilian dress in some open wooded area, vaguely wooded metropolitan area, presumably in Kiev itself. It's unclear, as I said, where it is. And the Ukrainian authorities are saying that these were the two assassins, the two people who assassinated Varonich, and who had been tracking him, and who had been provided with the instructions to assassinate Varonich by a person, an unidentified person, who apparently has evaded capture and who is identified simply as their handler. And the Ukrainian authorities, and this is for me the most important revelation, the Ukrainian authorities are claiming that these people who they say they killed and the handler were in fact working for Russia, that they were agents of the FSB, Russia's counterintelligence agency, or at least they were operating on behalf of the FSB. Now, there's a number of things to say here. First of all, the Ukrainians have not provided, as at the time of making this program, a huge amount of information about these two people that they say they have killed. I am not going to comment further about that. I've no reason to doubt that the Ukrainians are telling the truth when they say that these two individuals were indeed involved in Colonel Varonich's assassination. I'm not sure whether they're Ukrainians or Russians or people from an entirely different nationality. As I said, I'm not going to comment on the actual specific mechanics of this assassination. It's not unusual, I should say, in cases of this kind for murders of this sort to be committed by hired assassins who often come out of criminal networks, who may not fully understand either the nature of the person that they are tasked with killing, or the fact that this is something that is being done at the instruction of a foreign government. So it may be that we have witnessed or seen something of that nature here. But the key thing to say is that the Ukrainian authorities have now come forward and have specifically confirmed that it is the Russian authorities who were indeed responsible for the assassination of Colonel Varonich. And that, to my mind, though not, of course, completely conclusive, is another strong indication that that is indeed exactly what we're seeing. All of the facts about this killing, as far as I can see, point to the Russians having taken the decision to assassinate Varonich and to have implemented that assassination in light of the various actions that have been taken by the Ukrainians inside Russia. As I said, the two people who actually carried out the killing might have been, in fact, probably were, as far as the Russians were concerned, disposable assets. Just saying. I hope that doesn't sound too callous, But I understand that that is the way such things are often done. And it's likely that we are going to see a lot more of this over the next few weeks and months. And this is indeed inevitably going to create a frisson of alarm in Kiev, where up to now the Ukrainians have been able to carry out these kind of attacks against people inside Russia without fearing or anticipating retaliation against them by the Russians themselves. It does seem to me now that we're getting an accumulation of evidence that that picture is now changing. And to repeat again what I have said many times, just as the Russians are able to out-resource the Ukrainians in every field of military and indeed intelligence work, they could certainly out-resource the Ukrainians in operations of this kind. For a while, the Ukrainians will be able to take on the Russians on roughly equal terms, perhaps because the Ukrainians have more recent experience of doing this sort of thing. Just saying. But the Russians have a certain degree of experience themselves. They successfully carried out a dirty war against the jihadis they were fighting in the northern Caucasus in the 2000s and early 2010s. And it's only a question of time before the Russians draw first level with the Ukrainians and then start to move ahead of them. They can bring assets and resources to bear, which, as I said, it may take months, it may take years, in the end are going to surpass whatever it is that the Ukrainians in return can do. So we are now, it seems to me, and I think this is now conclusive, in a dirty war. This is not, of course, the first round. The Ukrainians began this kind of thing way back in 2014, apparently. I remember that reading, I think it was in the New York Times, that it was back in 2014 that the Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko, of that period, set up and authorized the Ukrainian security and intelligence services to start acting in this way. The Russians have delayed a response for over a decade, but they are now responding, and probably there's been intense pressure within the Russian intelligence and security systems for the gloves to be taken off. It looks as if they are, and we're probably going to see much more of this before long. And it is only a question of time before, I'm afraid, this kind of operation starts to reach the territories of third countries, and inevitably, before long, Europe is going to be one place where I think a lot of this sort of thing is going to happen. I say all of this with deep misgivings. I detest this kind of thing. I know that many people are thrilled and excited by it. Personally, I believe License to Kill and all that should be left in the realms of James Bond fiction. But it does happen, it does take place in the real world. Nobody who follows international affairs can be in any doubt about that. And, well, we're now going to see it play out between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And by the way, I should say that this conflict will probably continue for a long time, even if the Russians overrun the whole of Ukraine over the next year, say. It is likely that Ukrainian cells or Ukrainian established cells in Russia will continue to operate it is likely that various Ukrainian agencies, intelligence and secret agencies, will continue to function from outside Ukraine, in Europe and places like that. And of course, they will have their cells in Ukraine as well, and the Russians will be coming after them. This could continue for a decade, perhaps even longer. That is roughly the amount of time it took for the Russians to get on top of the various jihadi networks in the Caucasus. And as is well known, the Russians had to extend their operations to the Middle East to actually infiltrate and destroy the networks that were functioning in the Caucasus. But I have no doubt at all that in time they will do so. And in the meantime, it is likely that all sorts of individuals who don't quite understand the role that they are playing in this complex game, people who do not belong and are not personally affiliated to either country, that they're going to find that they're going to be drawn in to this affair. I've already mentioned how assassinations can be conducted through the use of contract killers and by contacting and working through organized crime networks. I suspect we are going to see an awful lot of that as well, and third-party nationals are likely to become involved. The fact that the Russians have now launched a major clean-up operation in Russia itself of various organized crime groups connected to Azerbaijan, and that they're now apparently taking steps to clean out Azerbaijanian descended nationals from Russian security and intelligence agencies. I'm getting reports, increasing numbers of reports about this from military industries, from all sorts of things of that kind. Could very well be connected with this very same dirty war that we are now seeing. It might be, and again I'm speculating, but these speculations are grounded in fact. It could very well be that as the Russians crank up to wage their dirty war against the Ukrainians, they are taking precautions to clean up groups and organizations within Russia itself that they worry might in time be a source for support and for recruits for the Ukrainians, and who might, by the way, have played some role in some of the previous activities that the Ukrainians were engaged in before. So this is now happening. As I said, I look upon it with no pleasure, but we have to get used to this. We have to prepare ourselves psychologically for this. This is going to be another fruit of this conflict in Ukraine, which began so heedlessly with the original Maidan protests and coup in 2014, and which continues to play out increasingly in all kinds of strange and difficult ways, and will continue to do so for the next few years. Anyway, in the meantime, the war itself goes on. Last night was a night when the Russians did not carry out a further big drone and missile strike on Ukraine. This is not unusual. The Russians conduct strikes and drone attacks regularly, night after night after night, and then there's usually a night of pause, and it's not difficult to get a sense of why the Russians do that. They want to assess the damage that has been done, to work out how extensive the damage to the various facilities that they have attacked actually is, and then, of course, the attack resumes. The Ukrainians, by the way, have been showing off some new system which they are using to try to bring down ground drones. Apparently, they have either 2 or 4 of these systems. I'm not going to comment on what these systems do and how they work. As far as I can see, they do involve guns, long range guns, to anti-aircraft guns to try to shoot down drones. Those, by the way, are surprisingly expensive, and it would not be, I think, a straightforward thing to bring them into mass production and operation again. We're just talking about another type of, actually, from what I know, rather expensive artillery. And of course, Ukraine is already having problems maintaining the artillery that it already has performing actually on the battlefield. During the Second World War, it's a little known fact, but it's something that I'm fairly familiar with, because the industrial and economic aspects of the Second World War, rather than the military ones, was a topic that I actually became quite absorbed in. It's a little known fact that the Allied bombing campaign on Germany did have one very important effect, which is, as I said, little discussed, which is that it compelled the Germans to divert a lot of their production of guns and artillery shells to anti-tank, anti-aircraft guns and shells specifically designed to shoot down high-altitude aircraft, what were called flak guns, what the Germans call flak guns. And that had a significant effect on the battlefronts, because the diversion of resources to that kind of artillery, anti-aircraft artillery, away from ground artillery, actually did have an effect, especially on the Eastern Front, where the Germans became increasingly outgunned by the Russians in the various battles that they faced as the Soviet advances westwards accelerated. Now, of course, Ukraine is in a much more difficult position here, because it's already short of guns. It's already short of artillery. It has no strong artillery production facilities. And, of course, it does claim to produce shells, but I have big question marks about that. And we know about the West's difficulties in producing shells. So if thousands of ground drones are flying over Ukraine every night, and Ukraine is trying to use guns to shoot down these ground drones, anti-aircraft guns, it's going to reduce still further Ukraine's ability to counter Russian advances with artillery. In a war of this kind, where one side is functioning with fewer resources, far fewer industrial resources than the other, then it becomes impossible to counter one threat without exposing oneself to another. And that is exactly what the dilemma that Ukraine is facing today. Anyway, let's not divert ourselves further too much from this, because I'm not absolutely sure about the nature of this new Ukrainian system. I know that there's been some suggestions that it all exists mostly in the imagination. But as I said, if it is some kind of attempt to shoot down ground drones using anti-aircraft guns and advanced radar systems, then, as I said, it is indeed going to produce all kinds of problems, follow-on problems of its own. Anyway, let's discuss briefly, say a few things about the military situation. And there are indications that the situation around Pokrovsk is becoming particularly difficult for the Ukrainians. The Russian Defense Ministry claims that another village near Pokrovsk in the northeastern sector of Pokrovsk, a place called Nikolaevka, has now fallen under Russian control. This place, so far as I can tell, appears to be located very close to the village of Novoekonomichny, which the Russians broke into some days ago, and where supposedly fierce fighting is taking place. Now, Ukrainian sources are now starting to confirm earlier claims that I'd seen from the Russians about very significant Russian advances northeast of Pokrovsk. And specifically, there are reports that a village is called Razinye and Fyodorivka, both of which are located north of Novoekonomichny, have in fact been captured by the Russians. So if this is correct, the Russians apparently now control a village called Mirny. I think I mentioned this some time ago. Immediately to the east of Novoekonomichny, they control Mykolaievka, which is located south of Novoekonomichny, and they now control these other places, Razinye and Fyodorivka. I should stress that I believe that the Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed the capture of Razinye, but not yet the capture of Fyodorivka. And of course it might be that all of these reports anyway are completely untrue. But anyway, I'm assuming that the capture of Fyodorivka is true. I've been hearing about it for a long time, and I understand that the Ukrainians are now sort of admitting that it has indeed been captured by the Russians, and that the Russians also control another village to the north of both of these places called Novotoretska, and that they are in the process of attacking some other villages in this area slightly to the east called Poltavka and Popiv Yar. Well, the key thing, the way to describe this or to explain this, is that Novoekonomichny itself is gradually being encircled, and if Razinye is indeed under Russian control, then the next village to the west of Razinye is another village called Rodinsky, and if the Russians capture that village, then the roads that lead, the supply road leading into Pokrovsk, will be cut, because the village of Rodinsky lies upon that road. So that road will in turn be cut. The Russians, of course, control the village of Kotlino to the southwest of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians made various attempts to recapture Kotlino in the autumn. I'll come to these Ukrainian counterattacks shortly, but there's no doubt that the Russians are in firm control of Kotlino. And if the Russians capture Rodinsky, then there's only one village essentially left to complete the circle around Pokrovsk. This is a village called Grishchinye, which is located to the northwest of Pokrovsk. If Rodinsky, Grishchinye are captured, then Pokrovsk, assuming that the Ukrainians have not retreated from it, is indeed encircled. I mean, not just encircled, but completely encircled. All the major supply lines are cut. And of course, the battle continues for Novo-Ekonomichny. There's a rather elaborate and perhaps somewhat fantastic claim, apparently coming from one Russian source, that the Russians have now broken Ukrainian defenses to the northwest of Novo-Ekonomichny. This is between Novo-Ekonomichny and, as far as I understand, Rodinsk as well, and that they are in the process of advancing to the coal mine, which is located between Mirnograd and Novo-Ekonomichny. I'm very skeptical about this claim, by the way. It seems to me borderline fantastic one. If this is true, then it looks to me as if Ukrainian defenses in the Pokrovsk area have indeed essentially collapsed, because it would be remarkable if this was indeed taking place. But of course, if it is taking place, then the Battle of Novo-Ekonomichny also is ending. If Novo-Ekonomichny is captured by the Russians, if the coal mine is captured with the Russians, then I would have thought that Rodinsk would certainly be next in line to fall. And as I said, at that point, we would not any longer be discussing an operational encirclement of Pokrovsk. I suspect that's already true. I've already discussed this before. All of these roads, the ones to the west and the ones to the north, which supply Pokrovsk, are already capable of being attacked by Russian FPV drones and other types of drones. The Ukrainians have been putting netting above these roads. But apparently the bigger drones, the Lancets and the Gerans, can break through this netting and can attack vehicles that operate along these roads and can destroy the netting. I suspect that Russian artillery strikes can destroy the netting as well, and of course bombing by the Russian Air Force can destroy the netting too. So the netting can only be of partial effect in a situation where the Russians have such an enormous preponderance in terms of material. Anyway, all of these roads are already, as I said, dangerous to use for the Ukrainians. They're all within range of Russian artillery and bombs, fab bombs, and drones and other things. But of course, if these two villages, Rodinsk and Grishinye, are captured, then it is the end of Pokrovsk. If the Russians can capture these villages, consolidate control, then Pokrovsk will fall, and will probably fall fairly quickly. In fact, repeating the pattern that we have repeatedly seen over the course of the war, basically since the fall of Lysychansk back in the summer of 2022, what invariably happens is that the Ukrainian High Command tells the Ukrainian forces in a particular town or village to stand firm and to go on fighting long beyond the point when the roads are closed. Then the soldiers who are trapped realize that they are at risk of capture or death and decide basically on their own initiative to flee. And they do then flee along the country roads and the open fields, hunted by the Russian drones and the Russian reconnaissance units that are chasing them, pursuing them. We've seen that play out to some after Lysychansk, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, after the fall of Ugledar, after the fall of Kurachovo, and I suspect that it's something similar that we're going to see happen following the fall of Pokrovsk. Just saying. So anyway, that's the situation there. And perhaps, and at the moment, this is the main battle, the key battle that is being fought in the war, though there are other places, Kamensk. Apparently there's now confirmation that the Russians do indeed control the whole of Kamensk, south of Zaporozhye, the city of Zaporozhye, and that they are indeed advancing north from Kamensk. They are continuing to advance westwards from along the western Donetsk area. My own view is that their next target there is this village of Novopavlivka in Dnipropetrovsk region. It's the next big place, apparently, west of Selidovo, which the Russians captured some time ago. I suspect that the Russians will eventually, before very long, seek to capture this place. Apparently it's quite heavily fortified, but the Russians are gradually working around it. And of course, if Pokrovsk were to fall, then it would be it would definitely fall quickly. But I suspect the Russians are going to try to capture this place before the Battle of Pokrovsk itself actually begins. But anyway, these are the three big fronts at the moment. I think the Russians calculate that if Pokrovsk falls, the major defense line that the Ukrainians have, Konstantinovka, Druzhivka, Slavyansk, a little to the east, would be in effect at serious danger of being outflanked. The Russians would be able to advance northwards from Pokrovsk to the next place, Dobropilia. There's some claims that the Russians are already advancing towards Dobropilia, that they are intending to capture this place before they capture Pokrovsk itself. I don't believe that. But anyway, that once that happens, as I said, the entire defense line that the Ukrainians have in eastern Donbass will become undefendable and will rapidly start to break down. So I think the main battle continues to be Pokrovsk. Now, I mentioned before that the Ukrainians have been claiming that they're conducting various counterattacks. There's reports of Ukrainian counterattacks south of Konstantinovka at the moment. There might be particular political importance in conducting these counterattacks because amongst the forces that the Ukrainians have south of Konstantinovka are units of the 12th Azov Brigade, a force that is not just considered an elite force, but which commands considerable pull within the Ukrainian command, has considerable political pull in Ukraine, and which, as I've said already, I think some sections of the regime, if I can call it that, in Ukraine, see as a potential Praetorian Guard as the situation overall deteriorates. So I can imagine that there would be particular urgency to try to break through to these people and to try perhaps to extract them from this area south of Konstantinovka where they are effectively trapped. But I have to make a general observation. Since the start of this year, there have been an unending succession of ephemeral Ukrainian counterattacks, which have always attracted a disproportionate amount of commentary and attention. There was attacks west of Pokrovsk, attempts to by the Ukrainians to recapture the village of Kotlino. I remember discussing them. There was attacks. We've had recent attacks to try to capture Totkino in Kursk region. There's an ongoing, or claimed to be ongoing, attacks, Ukrainian counterattacks in Sumy region. We had the reports about the Ukrainian counterattacks in Toretsk. We've had so many claims of Ukrainian counterattacks, and always they attract a huge amount of attention. The people who write the Telegram channels get very excited about them. There's a huge amount of chatter. I have always been a skeptic about all of these counterattacks. Most of them, in my opinion, are mostly media operations. And then what happens after a couple of days or weeks at the most, the dust settles. The ephemeral nature of these counterattacks, if they even happen, becomes clear. And once the dust has settled, it becomes clear that the Russians are where they always were. Kotlino, Totkino, the places the Ukrainians allegedly are seeking to recapture in Sumy region, Redkopub, in the Liman area, Toretsk, of course. It turns out that they're all back, or at least they are, as was originally reported, firmly under Russian control. So I wouldn't place any great weight in these Ukrainian counterattacks. We've had many claims about them over the last few weeks. Zelensky always talks about counterattacks and counteroffensives. There was claims recently that the Ukrainians are building up some kind of reserve to conduct a counteroffensive in some location. We've had many claims about counteroffensives from the Ukrainians for several weeks and months now. If you go back and look through the various Telegram channels and mapping projects, you will find all sorts of predictions and claims about these Ukrainian counteroffensives. But none of them happen, and the counterattacks invariably now melt away. In fact, today, as it happens, the Ukrainians have once again increased the total number of Russian forces which they claim are fighting within the boundary of pre-2014 Ukraine. The previous number the Ukrainians were giving was 640,000. They have now increased that number to 700,000. Now, I don't know whether that is true, and we should take all Ukrainian claims of this kind with a massive pinch of salt, just saying. But if the Ukrainians are to be believed, Russian numbers of troops on the battlefronts are growing. The Ukrainians don't give us much information about the size of their own forces, but reports from Ukraine all speak of declining numbers of Ukrainian infantry, and all of that makes it very, very doubtful that a Ukrainian counteroffensive can take place, and it is extremely unlikely that a Ukrainian counteroffensive will take place. Now, in my program yesterday, I spoke about this soldier who is fighting in Ukraine, or has been serving in Ukraine. As I said, I want to be very careful not to disclose information about him, who's been involved, shall we say, in one of the Ukrainian nationalist battalions, and from whom I have recently obtained, through a third party, a significant amount of information. I should make it clear, by the way, that this person did not reach out to me. I'm not going to discuss how it came about that through this third party we established contacts with each other. I would prefer not to discuss that. Anyway, I've heard more from him over the last few hours. One, which is all very interesting, is about the reception in Ukraine, within the Ukrainian military system, of the work that we do on the Duran, and of course the work that I do on my own channel. And he said some quite interesting and revealing things, which I'm not going to discuss, only to say that the reception was not quite what I had assumed it would be. It's different in some respects from what I had expected. Anyway, that's by the way, and it's perhaps the least important thing. He also provided with some commentary about the feelings that Ukrainians had about the operation in Kursk region, the offensive they were instructed to carry out in Kursk region in August. It seems that there is immense amount of resentment and criticism right across the Ukrainian military about that operation. And for the record, this particular individual also appears to believe, or at least does believe, that the operation in Kursk region was indeed a trap that the Russians laid for the Ukrainians, that the Russians knew perfectly well that the Ukrainians were intending to launch some kind of operation inside Russia's borders, and that they intentionally created conditions for a Ukrainian attack in Kursk region, which was what ultimately caused the disaster that the Ukrainians experienced. I must say this, an accumulation of commentary about this and information about this from multiple different sources now. I am still in contact, by the way, with the source who told me sometime before the Kursk operation began, the Ukrainian Kursk operation began, that the Russians were indeed laying a trap for the Ukrainians there. This information is now, I would say, at critical mass levels. So many people who were directly involved believe this, that I myself have long since come round to the view that at some level at least, this must be correct. Some kind of a trap was indeed laid for the Ukrainians there, and Zelensky and Syrsky walked right straight into it. Anyway, all of that was very interesting. But anyway, in summary, going back to what this Ukrainian soldier is saying, and bear in mind that he does come from one of the nationalist battalions, nothing that he has told me, or at least that I've learned from him, in any way affects or changes my perspective of the battlefields. On the contrary, it confirms what I have been thinking for some time, that Ukraine is indeed now ground down, that the Ukrainian military is indeed facing a military crisis, that it is the kind of crisis which, because of its remorseless nature, the way it creeps up, that makes it even more difficult to counter, and that Ukraine has no real response or way out from this crisis, except to hope for some kind of miracle, political miracle from the United States, which is the only country that anybody in Ukraine believes would be in a position to change the overall picture of the war. So there it is. Now, as I make this program, I've started to notice increasing commentary in the British media now, and the British media has been a holdout here, gradually starting to acknowledge that the war in Ukraine is indeed being lost. And, well, I perhaps go to him too often, but one person who I suppose is a kind of weather vane for this kind of thing is my old friend Simon Tisdall, the foreign policy editor of The Guardian. At least he was that for quite a long time. I'm not sure whether he is that any longer. But anyway, he's certainly an influential figure writing for The Guardian. And he's been there for a very long time as well. And today he has written an article which, for the first time, essentially acknowledges the reality that Ukraine is losing and is going to lose unless that miracle comes. And the article reads, the title of the article is, "What if Ukraine falls? This is no longer a hypothetical question and it must be answered urgently. Europe offers platitudes, Ukraine dithers, and Ukraine and its extraordinary people stand on the brink. NATO must step up." And the article then acknowledges that it has been evident since the dying days of 2023 when its counteroffensive stalled. I find it incredible that even after all this time, someone like Simon Tisdall, even in an article where he's in effect admitting that Ukraine is losing, cannot quite bring himself to admit the obvious truth that Ukraine's counteroffensive of 2023, the summer offensive in Zaporozhye region that was intended to break through to the Sea of Azov and to the Black Sea, was defeated by the Russians. The Russians defeated it. It didn't stall. Anyway, he says that it has been evident since the days of 2020, the dying days of 2023, when its counteroffensive stalled, that Ukraine is not winning. Again, why not simply straightforwardly say that it is losing, not winning? For most of this year, Russian forces have inexorably inched forward in Donetsk and other eastern killing grounds, regardless of cost. And then he comes up with the usual fantasies about the vast casualties that the Russians are suffering, but he says that still they keep coming whilst there's been no big Russian breakthrough. For Ukraine's pinned down, undersupplied defenders, the war is now a daily existential struggle. How much longer Ukraine can hold the line on the battlefield, in the skies, and diplomatically and politically is in serious doubt. And he then talks about the fact that temporary successes, he talks about the Kursk operation, which was not a success, it was a disaster, by the way. Temporary successes do not alter the basic imbalance of power or the general direction of travel. Direction of travel is, in my opinion, is in my belief, it is one of my trademark phrases. Perhaps it's not just I who reads Simon Tisdall. Perhaps he's getting his information from more sources than he's prepared to acknowledge. Just saying. But anyway, he is finally coming round to the reality that Ukraine is going to lose the war. And he laments, he complains, he laments the fact that the Europeans are not doing all the things that they're supposed to have done or promised to do. He refers to Trump as the US surrender monkey, which seems a bizarre thing to call Trump, in my opinion. But anyway, he complains about Trump limiting supplies of defensive weapons to Ukraine and things of that kind. As I've said already, Trump cannot supply weapons that do not exist and which the United States does not have the industrial capacity to produce. But anyway, there it is. So Tisdall's solution to this crisis is the one that he has been plugging ever since the start of the conflict. He wants sanctions to stop supplies, global supplies of Russian oil. He also wants the West to intervene directly and militarily in the war. He wants, he says the military position is clear-cut, the legal and humanitarian case is unassailable. He's wrong about the legal case, to say it straightforwardly. He says that the way to do it is for the West, in effect, to directly enter the war. He doesn't exactly say that, but that's clearly the implication, and to engage the Russians in battle in Ukraine. But anyway, there it is. That's what he wants to do. But in all other respects, he's now forced to acknowledge that the war in Ukraine is being lost. A very similar article appeared the previous day in the Daily Telegraph by Lisa Hazeldine, and there have been other articles to that effect as well. The realities on the battlefields, the realities in the sky, are becoming so overwhelming that even those who might be described as Ukraine's most fervid supporters are finding them impossible to challenge. All that they have left is to continue to argue that the Russians are paying a colossal price for their ongoing offensive. Now, Simplicius the Thinker has written another fine piece on his Substack blog, which actually takes on this whole narrative about massive Russian losses and how this is supposedly holding back the Russian offensive, or at least is that the Russian offensive is being conducted or achieved in the face of prodigious losses. And he starts by referencing a claim from the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, that the Russians have lost 100,000 men killed since the start of this year. 100,000 Russian soldiers have died since the 1st of January. But he points out that the only agency that actually tries to tabulate the figures in the West using what might be called sound methodologies, which is Mediazona, says that the total number of Russian deaths that it has recorded is 116,718 as of July 2025, which is the same number as Rubio is saying the Russians have lost in men killed since the start of the year. And that from 1st January 2025 to 3rd July 2025, Russia lost 9,849 men killed in confirmed military deaths. A tenth of what Marco Rubio says. Now, I have, to some extent, lost faith in Mediazona, and I make no secret about this. Firstly, they changed their methodology some time ago to include projected deaths rather than real counted ones in the sort of headline figures that they produce. Clearly, the actual recorded deaths weren't high enough. And instead of standing their ground and saying that they were not going to change their methodology by introducing a speculative element, they changed their methodology and spoke about projected deaths. So that shook my belief in them. And then there was an article on the Grey Zone by Kit Clarenberg, which came out in May, which made it clearer to me who actually set up Mediazona, which people in Russia set up Mediazona. They're people well known to me. And I'm afraid that shook my confidence in them even further. And the fact that they were seeking funding from the British authorities. They denied the fact, but Kit Clarenberg provided information to this effect, which I found overwhelmingly convincing. Anyway, that has shaken my confidence in them further. I am even sceptical now about their figures of confirmed deaths. It's not that I find a number of 116,718 since the 22nd of February 2022 unconvincing or implausible. It's just that given the source, given the concerns I have about the source, Mediazona, I can't accept their figures straightforwardly anymore unless and until there is corroboration, external corroboration of them. But anyway, the point is that even they are providing numbers which are less, far less, than any Western media outlet said in terms of confirmed deaths. And as Simplicius the thinker points out, in fact, the total number of deaths has actually been falling. Reported confirmed deaths has been falling again for some time, even according to Mediazona's figures, and has been falling basically since midwinter of this year. So none of that corroborates these claims about titanic Russian losses as the Russian advance pushes westwards. On the contrary, it could be that as Ukrainian resistance becomes fragmented and more disorganized, the actual number of Russian casualties is falling. Simplicius the thinker also makes a very interesting further point, which derives apparently from a comment made by one of his readers on a thread to one of his articles, which is that the Ukrainians have been claiming for some time that their drones are what are causing the largest number of Russian casualties, in which case, since these drones always operate with cameras, which then feed back information to the controllers, the Ukrainians ought to have a record, an actual record for 70% at least of the Russian losses that they are inflicting. And if the losses are anything like as high as they claim, why are they not producing more of this footage? Well, there might be all kinds of explanations for this. It could be that the Ukrainians have some security reasons for not releasing much of the footage that perhaps they have. But I have to say, overall, rather like this reader and Simplicius the thinker as well, I too would have expected that if the Ukrainians do have information that can publicly corroborate the number of deaths that they are saying, then they would be producing it. Anyway, there it is. Meanwhile, Zelensky himself has been making further statements, and he now confirms definitely that Umerov is destined for dismissal as Ukraine's defense minister, and he's going to be packed off apparently to Washington as ambassador there. There's no word as to whether Umerov is going to act as chief negotiator, is going to continue to act as chief negotiator in discussions with the Russians. That's just to say. The rumours that are circulating suggest that the next defense minister, the person who's going to take over as defense minister from Umerov, is the current Ukrainian Prime Minister, Mr. Shmyhal. Well, we'll see. I'm not sure what qualifies Mr. Shmyhal to become defense minister. He presumably does have some knowledge of Ukraine's defense industries, but it does seem, again, a strange choice. But then Umerov, in some respects, was also a strange choice. Perhaps bears saying that Umerov has, to my knowledge, been just over a year in post, and already we see that Zelensky is now thinking of shuffling him off to Washington. It doesn't seem to me as if Umerov has shone in his post as defense minister. Had he done so, one assumes that Zelensky would want to keep him there. Anyway, it does look as if there's going to be another rearrangement of the deck chairs on the Titanic. Apologies, the positions in the Ukrainian political and military leadership. I can't help but feel that to some extent this also reflects growing stresses, political stresses in Kiev in light of the ongoing crisis on the battlefronts. But anyway, there it is. That, it seems, is what Zelensky now plans to do. There is no word for the moment that he is interested in sending his delegation to speak to the Russians in Istanbul. Both the Russians and the Turks have been saying that they are waiting for the Ukrainians to come back with their response to the Russian memorandum. As I said in several programs, Zelensky has never been keen on the negotiations in Istanbul. He did everything he possibly could to prevent them taking place at all. And of course, he has never rescinded his October 2022 decree, which anyway prohibited such negotiations from taking place. So he's not keen on those negotiations. He continues to talk about a summit meeting between himself and Putin, something that the Russians have repeatedly and straightforwardly rejected. I myself think that the Istanbul process is, to all intents and purposes, dead. I can't imagine that Zelensky's keen on it. It's clear that the Ukrainians are not interested in it. I don't think it's going to head anywhere anytime soon. Zelensky's hopes continue to be pinned on Donald Trump and on the Western powers. And here I continue to feel that he continues to be completely delusional because, well, we just had that conference in Italy to provide economic reconstruction funding for Ukraine. As I discussed in my program yesterday, BlackRock has pulled out completely from that project. There were no investors in it. The entire meeting apparently was a complete failure. There is considerable criticism in Germany of Friedrich Merz for wasting his time by turning up to that conference, apparently. So that conference produced nothing. And so far, despite all of the talk and push melodrama that we've seen between the Ukrainians and the Americans, despite all of Donald Trump's pledges and promises, so far, all that's produced is 10 Patriot air defense missile interceptors, which is less than Ukraine would expect to launch over the course of a single Russian attack. Just saying. So I don't know what it is exactly that Zelensky still expects the Americans to do. Tomorrow, Donald Trump is going to make his big announcement on Russia. He's apparently, there are rumors that he's now thinking of announcing the confiscation of the $5 billion in Russian frozen assets on the territory of the United States itself. That might lead the way for the Europeans to confiscate the much larger amount of frozen assets that the Russians have in Europe, 300 billion apparently in total, including around 240 billion in terms of Russian central bank reserves. Just saying. But that's money. Most of it, of course, will not help Ukraine, whose economy is in deep crisis. And I'm not going to even discuss in this program, I don't intend to discuss in this program, the extreme illegality of that move and the massive damage it would do to the credibility of the Western financial system. I've discussed that in many previous programs, and we've also done that on the Duran itself. So anyway, that's at the moment what Trump is thinking about. For the moment, at least, it looks as if the sanctions package that Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham are trying to put together in the Senate, that's still in limbo because Trump still wants further control on whether or not he can raise or waive tariffs on Russians on countries that are Russian trading partners. So it looks as if we're still some distance from seeing that particular package come to fruition. And Trump, even as he talks sanctions against Russia, what he's actually in the meantime doing is imposing more tariffs on historic American allies and key trading partners. So he followed up with the tariff that he imposed on Brazil, with 30% tariffs against the European Union and Mexico. The Europeans are shocked, shocked by the fact that he has imposed such high tariffs on them. What it will do to German industry, I really cannot imagine. Friedrich Merz, who has completely botched a question of filling vacancies on the German Constitutional Court. It's a tangled story that I don't intend to discuss in this program, but suffice to say that he appeared first to endorse and then reject a candidate proposed by the SPD, his main coalition partner. Anyway, that's a tangled story that I'm not going to discuss. But anyway, Merz, who still seems to be obsessively focused with Turkey taking on the Russians, he is ignoring the fact that relations between Germany and Russia having been an important trade partner of Germany, having once been discussed as Germany's future economic hinterland. Anyway, that relationship has been destroyed, and Merz appears determined that it should continue that way. Merz continues to destroy Germany's relations with China. There's a very strange incident a couple of days ago in which Germany complained vociferously, the Merz government complained vociferously about an incident which took place between a German reconnaissance aircraft and a Chinese warship in the Red Sea. According to the Germans, the Chinese used laser beams to disrupt or almost blind the German pilots on this reconnaissance aircraft. This was a outrageous action, provocative action by China. There's been German complaints about this against China. The Chinese are responding by saying they have absolutely no idea what the Germans are talking about. They say that the whole story is completely false, and that the Chinese Defense Ministry has clarified first that a Chinese naval group was conducting an escort mission in the Gulf of Aden and was not in the Red Sea at all. So it was not where the Germans alleged the incident took place. And secondly, that the Chinese vessels who were present in the Gulf of Aden did not in fact activate or use any laser equipment. Germany, and I'm taking all this from Global Times, made a big scene over what was essentially a complete misunderstanding. It's a polite way of saying that the Germans are lying. And the Chinese are getting more and more angry that the Germans won't address any of these issues. And the Global Times article says that the German side simply states that it has taken note of China's statement, but it insists that it has continued its investigation. And even though no evidence has been made public, the Germans continue to insist that their evidence is supposedly solid, even though the Chinese say that there is no reality to this whole incident at all. And Global Times speculates that the Germans might have misidentified something, but it was not what they claim it was, and that this is all an entirely baseless accusation. I think the Chinese believe, or at least are trying to imply, that the Germans are lying. And, well, China's relations with Germany are deteriorating. The days when China needed Germany as a major trade partner, it seems to me, are now conclusively in the past. And Germany, in theory, however, needs China as a trade partner. But all of these actions that Merz and his government are taking, this particular incident, ensure that it is less and less likely to remain one. So Germany, its major trade partner outside Europe, therefore, is the United States. Merz is taking a pro-American position, or at least an Atlanticist position, would perhaps be more accurate, in picking quarrels with Russia and China. But his erstwhile American allies are putting a 30% tariff on German industrial exports to the United States at a time when Germany's industrial economy is already in crisis. One would have thought that that would be Merz's priority, but of course it is not. Riding his hobby horses, his extreme hostility to Russia, and his probably equal hostility to China continues to be more important for him. And in terms of domestic policy, to a great extent, so far as I can see, he has surrendered large areas of it to his SPD coalition partners. I am starting to think that he might be out of his job by the end of this year. That might be optimistic. It might be a case of wishful thinking on my part, because Germany is a country, as I know very well, and of which I am very fond. But anyway, we shall have to wait and see. So, anyway, these seem to be the matters that are of more importance to the Western powers at the moment. Their own tariff wars, their own economic problems. They are out of money to help Ukraine, except perhaps stolen Russian money, which could make their economic situation, worse still. And they're out of weapons to send to Ukraine. So why Zelensky continues to look to them for help, I simply cannot see. Meanwhile, the other side, if I can call it that, continues to build up its relations. Lavrov has just conducted a very, very long, several-day-long visit to North Korea, where he met the North Korean foreign minister and Kim Jong-un himself. The relationship between North Korea and Russia is now officially on an allied basis. The Russians are saying that they're going to build monuments to the North Korean soldiers who fought in Kursk region. Lavrov was careful to say in a press conference that it was Kim Jong-un who proposed sending the North Korean military to participate in the liberation of Kursk region. The Russians didn't ask for that help, and it seems didn't expect an offer of that help. But, as Lavrov says, they had no reason to refuse. And, of course, out of this crisis, one of the big winners is Kim Jong-un. A few years ago, just 5 years ago, I remember how close and friendly relations between Russia and South Korea were. I also remember how the Russians were working hard to maintain a civil relationship with North Korea, but were under pressure to go along with all of the various other sanctions that were being imposed upon the North Koreans in light of North Korea's nuclear program. We can be confident that all of those sanctions, especially the economic ones, have now basically evaporated into the mist. The Russians are not going to enforce those UN sanctions anymore. They will now undoubtedly provide North Korea with products that North Korea needs, fertilizer for its agricultural economy, oil and gas for its industrial economy, and probably technology as well. North Korea's long period of isolation, economic isolation, is ended. It has emerged from it a much more powerful country than the one it was when it went in. It has suffered terribly in the process. There was the period of famine, apparently, in the 90s. I say apparently because there are, I know, on the part of certain of the humanitarian agencies in the West, some doubts about how severe the famine actually was. But all of that now is history. The North Korean economy is apparently growing, and there's every reason to think that it will, and it now has a secure trading partner who can provide it with the raw materials and technology that it needs. And of course, where the Russians go, the Chinese, with their much deeper and larger pockets, are certain to follow. And in fact, they're not probably following, they're probably there as well. So North Korea, as I said, is now in a much stronger position than it was. And of course, the political situation in South Korea has changed completely, and there is a new government and a new president there who looks like he might be interested in re-establishing the previous relationship with Russia. But of course the damage has been done, and Lavrov made it clear that whatever overtures Russia now receives from South Korea, North Korea is now officially again Russia's ally. Following up from this visit to North Korea, Lavrov has gone on to China. The Chinese media have produced photos of Lavrov's arrival. He is there, all smiles at Beijing airport. There are various Chinese officials there to meet him. He's already had a meeting with Wang Yi. We don't yet have Russian or Chinese readouts. It's worth mentioning the fact that Lavrov met Wang Yi just a couple of days ago in Kuala Lumpur. I discussed the Russian and Chinese readouts in my program yesterday. Well, they're meeting again, this time in Beijing, where other foreign ministers of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization are also going to be present. And the Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, is expected to be there as well. And lastly, the Russians have published a furious, vehement denial of a story in Axios that Russia is backing Trump's demand that Iran agree to zero enrichment. The moment I saw that article in Axios, I suspected that this would cause trouble and that the Russians would not be pleased to see it published. Anyway, the Russian Foreign Ministry has published a statement condemning that article as a politicized smear campaign. One can only guess who ordered the publication, and notice the word ordered, so that suggests that it was somebody maybe within the Trump administration. At least the Russians think so. One can only guess who ordered the publication, but one of the latest reports, titled "Scoop: Putin Urges Iran to Take Zero Enrichment Nuclear Deal with US," is apparently yet another politicized smear campaign meant to escalate tensions around the Iranian nuclear program. The Russians were furious about this story. It clearly wasn't true. One wonders, as I said, who thought to publish that piece in Axios. I presume it was done by somebody within the Trump administration. Perhaps an attempt to lead the Iranians to think that the Russians were coming round to American thinking on the question of Iran's nuclear enrichment program. All that piece of trickery has achieved is to anger the Russians and to damage American credibility on everything connected to the diplomacy around Iran's nuclear enrichment program, even further making a restart of negotiations between Iran and the United States even more difficult, and ensuring that the Russians are going to be even less willing to play a positive role than perhaps they already were. Anyway, there it is. Ukraine is now losing the war. Even its supporters are now starting to see that. Nobody, however, coming up with any realistic proposals on how that disaster can be avoided. Disaster for the West, I should say, and of course for Ukraine. And with every day that passes, the opportunities to preserve Ukraine, and it is now an existential question, those possibilities, those opportunities grow smaller and smaller. Anyway, there it is. This is where I'm going to finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.